In 1498, Leonardo da Vinci completed a painting that would become one of the most studied and debated works of art in human history. The Last Supper is not just a biblical scene. For centuries, researchers, historians, and theologians have insisted that Leonardo embedded layers of symbolism, geometry, and coded meaning in every gesture and every line. Yet even after more than 500 years of analysis, one detail continues to puzzle experts. Among the 12 apostles, there is a figure making a very specific hand gesture. At first glance, it seems ordinary, just another reaction to Christ's announcement of betrayal. But when specialists isolated the gesture and compared it to artworks, artifacts, and symbolic imagery across different cultures, something unexpected emerged. The gesture is identical to the one found in representations of non-human entities, described in ancient accounts and in certain modern depictions of anthropomorphic beings. This discovery raised a question that no one was prepared for. Was Leonardo simply capturing a moment of emotion, or was he referencing a symbol he believed carried a deeper meaning? Leonardo da Vinci was not only a painter, he was a scientist, anatomist, engineer, and observer of the natural and the unknown. He filled thousands of pages with studies of flight, anatomy, astronomy, and ideas far ahead of his time. So when a gesture appears in his work that mirrors a symbol found in completely different contexts, it invites a new and unsettling possibility. Was Da Vinci warning us? Was he hinting at something he saw, something he read, or something he suspected? The more researchers compared the images, the more disturbing the similarity became. Two figures separated by centuries and by completely different worlds, yet expressing the same precise motion of the hands. Today you will see why this detail caught the attention of experts, how this gesture appears in unexpected places, and why some believe Leonardo embedded a message for those able to recognize patterns hidden in plain sight. Whether you see it as coincidence, symbolism, or something far more enigmatic, one thing becomes clear. The Last Supper still guards secrets that continue to surface piece by piece, as if Leonardo knew his work would only be fully questioned centuries after it was painted. To understand why this gesture matters, we must first understand the man behind the painting. Leonardo da Vinci rarely included anything by accident. Every brushstroke, every shadow, every angle of light served a purpose. He observed human behavior with an intensity few artists ever matched, and he studied the movement of the body the same way he studied machines, mechanisms, and celestial patterns. For him, gestures were language, and language was code. Yet the gesture that caught the attention of experts does not match the emotional vocabulary typically used in Renaissance religious art. It is not a gesture of shock, reverence, or despair. It is structured, deliberate, almost ritualistic. When researchers isolated the position of the fingers and mapped the geometry of the hands, they discovered a pattern that appears in artifacts from cultures separated by continents and vast periods of time. Mesopotamian figurines, depictions found in Ethiopian manuscripts, and sketches from esoteric European traditions all repeat the same configuration of the hands. In these contexts, the gesture is associated with transmission of knowledge, revelation, and encounters with beings described as messengers. This parallel does not prove anything, but it raises an important question. How would Leonardo have encountered this symbol? What tradition was he referencing? The more scholars revisited his notebooks, the more they found that Leonardo was endlessly curious about what he called the invisible architecture of reality. He filled pages with studies of proportion, harmony, optics, and spiritual mechanics. He wrote about the connection between geometry and consciousness, about the hidden mathematics of nature, and about patterns he believed were universal. For someone like Leonardo, a gesture might represent more than a simple emotional reaction. It could represent an idea, a signal, a teaching encoded inside a sacred narrative. but a teaching for whom? Another detail deepens the mystery. The gesture in the Last Supper appears in a moment of tension, immediately after Christ reveals that betrayal is near. In the structure of the painting, the gesture sits at the boundary between revelation and collapse, as if pointing to the precise moment when hidden truths become unbearable. When researchers layered the gesture over modern depictions of non-human anthropomorphic beings, the alignment was unsettling. The same curvature, the same positioning of the thumb, the same tension between the fingers. It is as if two artists separated by centuries were referencing the same symbolic language. This raises another possibility. If Leonardo believed that knowledge could be transmitted through symbols, then placing this gesture inside a biblical scene would have been a way to preserve something without saying it explicitly. He knew that texts could be censored and ideas could be destroyed, but art could survive. Art could travel. Art could hide messages that only a few would ever decode. The Renaissance was a time of secrecy and coded communication. Artists, philosophers, and scientists often disguised their insights inside images to avoid surveillance, punishment, or condemnation. So the question becomes unavoidable. Did Leonardo embed the gesture as a silent warning? Was he hinting that something about the story, the setting, or the moment in history carried a meaning beyond the surface? Or was he simply fascinated by symbols that appear in both human and mythic imagery? Experts remain divided. Some believe it is coincidence. Others insist that Leonardo was too intentional, too meticulous, to repeat a gesture that did not belong to the emotional vocabulary of the scene. Yet all agree on one thing. The more the painting is examined, the more it seems to contain layers designed for a viewer far beyond Leonardo's century. If that is true, then the Last Supper is not just a depiction of a sacred moment. It is a message encoded in plain sight, waiting for someone centuries later to compare the right images and finally see what Leonardo was pointing to. The gesture might be small, almost invisible amid the chaos of the scene, but its symbolism could be the key to understanding what he really wanted to communicate. And if that message was a warning, then the question on the thumbnail becomes more than a theory. It becomes a possibility we cannot ignore. Was Leonardo da Vinci warning us about something hidden behind our reality? Something he believed humanity would only be ready to question many generations after his death? But the mystery deepens when we examine the structure that surrounds the gesture itself. The Last Supper is not a spontaneous composition. Leonardo built it using mathematical frameworks so precise that architects and codebreakers have spent decades trying to map its internal geometry. When those researchers placed the gesture inside Leonardo's grid system, something extraordinary happened. The hand aligns with a point known in sacred geometry as the threshold between the visible and the unseen, a point where artists and mystics believed the physical world intersects with higher forms of intelligence. This was not typical for Renaissance religious art. Most painters of the era relied on intuition and tradition. Leonardo relied on mathematics, astronomy, and proportions derived from ancient mystical texts. He believed that geometry was not just a tool, but a language. And if geometry was language, then symbols were sentences. Patterns were messages, and gestures could serve as signatures left for those able to decode them. Some researchers noticed another anomaly. Directly behind the figure making the gesture, the folds of the garments and the shadows on the wall create a subtle pattern that mirrors diagrams found in Leonardo's notebooks. Diagrams connected to his studies on light refraction and what he called the architecture of perception. These diagrams explore how the human eye interprets shapes that do not belong to the physical world. To some scholars, this suggests that Leonardo was guiding the viewer to look not at the figure itself, but at the relationship between gesture, shadow, and perspective, as if the true message is revealed only when the elements are seen as a single composition. But the question remains, what kind of message would Leonardo hide in a biblical scene? And why would he risk placing it in such a public work? This brings us to a part of Leonardo's life that is often ignored. His private circles, his intellectual correspondences, his fascination with knowledge that was forbidden, suppressed, or dismissed by the church. Leonardo had access to manuscripts that very few in Europe had seen. Some of them came from travelers who studied in the East. Others were remnants of Hermetic traditions, preserved by scholars who operated on the margins of accepted theology. Within these texts were descriptions of entities portrayed not as angels or demons, but as intermediaries, bearers of knowledge, shapes neither entirely human nor entirely other. And among these manuscripts, one symbol appears repeatedly, the same configuration of the hands. For the Church, this symbol represented doctrines that blurred the line between divine and human, revelation and heresy. For Leonardo, it may have represented something else, the universal shape of communication between intelligence and intuition, the gesture made at the boundary between what can be understood and what can only be experienced. This perspective gains strength when we analyze Leonardo's obsession with what he called the veil. In his writings, he mentions that reality is layered, not linear, that what we perceive is only the beginning, and what lies behind perception is accessible only through symbols, not words. He wrote that geometry and gesture are bridges, and that those who learn to interpret them could see beyond the veil. When placed in this context, the gesture in the Last Supper becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a clue, a portal, a deliberate reference to the idea that behind the sacred story there is another story, one that Leonardo believed only the future would have the tools to question. And then comes the most disturbing connection of all. The modern depiction of the non-human figure you saw in the comparison, the one with the same gesture, comes from a field Leonardo could never have imagined, yet somehow paralleled. How could a gesture repeated in ancient symbols, forbidden manuscripts, and Renaissance art reappear in modern imagery associated with beings described as observers, messengers, or watchers? There are only three explanations. The first is coincidence, unlikely given the precision of the gesture. The second is influence, that both images come from a forgotten symbolic tradition Leonardo studied. The third is the one experts hesitate to mention publicly, that Leonardo encoded a warning about something he believed interacts with humanity from behind the edges of perception. Something that he thought future generations would eventually recognize. Which brings us back to the question on the thumbnail, not as speculation, not as entertainment, but as a possibility rooted in geometry, symbols, and the patterns Leonardo left behind for those who would one day look with a different kind of vision. Was Da Vinci warning us? And if he was, what exactly did he expect us to find? To understand what Leonardo may have been pointing to, we need to look at how he approached truth itself. Leonardo did not see truth as something offered directly. He believed truth was something that had to be uncovered layer by layer. In his notes, he wrote that the eyes are easily deceived when they look only at the surface, but when trained to observe relationships, shapes, and proportions, the eyes begin to perceive structures that ordinary vision cannot access. For Leonardo, seeing was a form of decoding. Perception was a key, and reality was a locked door. This idea becomes even more intriguing when we examine the placement of the mysterious gesture within the overall geometry of the painting. When code analysts used modern software to map perspective lines, they found that the gesture sits at the convergence of several invisible paths. These paths match the same geometry Leonardo used in his anatomical studies and his diagrams of celestial mechanics. Whether intentional or not, the gesture occupies the position Leonardo reserved for phenomena that bridge the human world and the world of unseen forces. This is where the investigation takes a darker turn. Among Leonardo's private sketches are studies of what he called forms of perception. Some look like abstract geometry, but others show shapes that resemble silhouettes not entirely human. Scholars often dismiss these sketches as imaginative exercises, but the positioning of the hands in these drawings has never been fully explained. When placed side by side with the isolated gesture from the Last Supper, the similarity becomes undeniable. Leonardo was exploring something he did not describe directly. Whatever it was, he expressed it through symbols rather than words. The symbolism becomes even stronger when we connect this gesture to the cultural artifacts that mirror it. In Mesopotamian figurines, the gesture appears during scenes of communication with what were described as beings of knowledge. In Ethiopian manuscripts, it appears beside figures who guide the protagonist through visions or revelations. In European esoteric traditions, the gesture marks the moment when a hidden truth is transmitted from teacher to apprentice. Across cultures, the gesture marks a threshold between ignorance and insight, between the known and the unknown. This raises another question. If Leonardo truly integrated this gesture with mathematical precision, cultural echoes, and a symbolic role that transcends geography and time, then why did he choose to place it in the exact scene where betrayal is revealed? The Last Supper captures the moment when truth rises and illusion collapses, when loyalty fractures, when destiny becomes unavoidable. Leonardo could have chosen any gesture for dramatic effect, yet he chose one whose symbolic roots point to revelation, forbidden knowledge, and encounters with the unknown. Some experts argue that Leonardo used this gesture to represent a specific type of knowledge, not intellectual knowledge, but knowledge that destabilizes, knowledge that changes those who receive it, knowledge that transforms perception of reality itself. This kind of knowledge appears frequently in Renaissance occult writings, especially those influenced by Hermetic philosophy. These texts describe certain symbols as gateways for the mind. A gesture, when recognized, triggers a shift in awareness. It becomes a silent initiation. If Leonardo had access to these traditions, the gesture in the Last Supper may represent precisely that, an initiation hidden inside a sacred narrative. A signal for those who understand that revelation often arrives in disguise. Some scholars even suggest that Leonardo believed humanity was not ready for the truths he suspected. Rather than risking persecution, he encoded them silently, trusting that future generations would discover them when their understanding of reality matured. This leads to a final and unsettling pattern. When advanced imaging of the painting was done to reveal underlayers, analysts found that the hand making the gesture had been repainted more carefully than surrounding areas. Leonardo spent more time perfecting its angles, shadow, and tension than he did on some of the faces. He adjusted the position multiple times. He intensified the contrast around the knuckles. He ensured that the gesture would remain visible even as pigments aged. This level of attention suggests intentionality far beyond mere artistic choice. The possibility grows stronger that Leonardo wanted this gesture to survive time, that he wanted it to raise questions long after his death, that he wanted it to be discovered only when viewers could compare it to modern imagery, when technology and global culture had expanded enough to make the recognition possible. And now that the comparison has been made, the question no longer feels theoretical. It becomes something else, a turning point, a provocation, a clue left by a mind centuries ahead of its time, challenging us to question what he saw, what he studied, and what he believed humanity should eventually confront. If Leonardo encoded a warning inside the Last Supper, then we are only beginning to understand what he was pointing to. And the gesture, once dismissed as ordinary, may be the most important key he left behind. To move forward, we must consider another aspect of Leonardo's mindset. He believed that truth travels in cycles. In his journals, he wrote that knowledge appears in stages and that each generation uncovers only what it is prepared to understand. This idea becomes especially significant when we study his fascination with ancient texts. Leonardo did not rely solely on sources approved by the Church. He read fragments of Hermetic philosophy, mathematical treatises preserved by Arabic scholars, and descriptions of ancient rites that blended science, myth, and cosmology. In all these documents, one theme repeated itself. The universe communicates through patterns. This belief shaped much of Leonardo's work. He did not see the world as a collection of isolated objects, but as a system where everything reflects everything else. This is why similarities across cultures fascinated him. If a symbol appeared in Mesopotamia, Ethiopia, and Europe, he did not see coincidence. He saw a universal pattern hidden beneath appearances. For Leonardo, discovering a repeated gesture meant discovering a thread that links civilizations across centuries. This brings us to a discovery that shocked some modern researchers. When the gesture from the Last Supper was analyzed using pattern recognition technology, it was found to match not only ancient figurines and manuscripts, but also diagrams used in secret European societies during the 15th century. These groups believed that certain hand configurations could represent mental states capable of receiving higher forms of insight. Whether or not this is true is not the point. What matters is that Leonardo lived in a world where such symbols circulated quietly, far from public eyes, passed only to those who sought deeper understanding. Leonardo belonged to no secret society officially, yet his notebooks show an unmistakable awareness of these symbolic systems. He copied diagrams that resemble initiation symbols. He drew circles divided according to Hermetic geometry. He sketched figures whose hands form shapes not found in classical art. This suggests that Leonardo was not simply curious about hidden knowledge. He was actively integrating symbolic systems into his work. When the gesture in the Last Supper is seen through this lens, its placement becomes even more deliberate. It sits directly at the emotional and spiritual fracture point of the narrative. Christ announces betrayal. The room shifts. Every apostle reacts with shock, confusion, and fear. Yet one figure presents a gesture that does not express emotion, but intention. It looks less like a reaction and more like a signal, a quiet assertion of something revealed, understood, or witnessed. A gesture that does not match the moment yet belongs to the deeper structure of meaning Leonardo often wove into his compositions. The context becomes even more mysterious when we consider the Renaissance fear of forbidden knowledge. Ideas that challenged the nature of the divine or the structure of reality were suppressed quickly. Leonardo, aware of this danger, often hid his most controversial ideas inside drawings that only the trained eye would understand. He used anatomical studies to disguise spiritual investigation. He used mechanical diagrams to mask philosophical questions. He used biblical scenes to embed concepts that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the hidden architecture of existence. This is why art historians believe Leonardo preferred to encode rather than declare. If he suspected that humanity was being observed or influenced by forces beyond ordinary perception, he would not write it openly. But he could embed a gesture. He could choose a symbol that existed long before him and would continue to exist long after him. He could place it in a painting that would be studied for centuries. He could trust that eventually someone would compare the right images and notice what he had noticed. The implications of this become even stronger when one more anomaly is taken into account. In the underdrawings detected beneath the Last Supper, the position of several apostles was adjusted during the painting process. Most of these adjustments refined posture and composition, but the hand making the gesture was corrected repeatedly. Leonardo redrew it several times, refining the angle of each finger with a precision that suggests it mattered far more than the surrounding figures. He wanted the gesture to be unmistakable even centuries later. This meticulous attention has puzzled scholars for decades. Why would Leonardo invest such effort in a gesture that contributes so little to the narrative tension of the scene? The answer may lie not in the story being told, but in the story being hidden. If Leonardo believed that gestures carry symbolic weight, then refining this specific gesture could have been his way of ensuring that a message survived beneath the layers of time. The modern world inadvertently completed the circle. Only today, with access to global imagery, advanced symbolism studies and pattern recognition, can we compare the gesture to depictions far outside the Renaissance. Only now can we see its parallel in representations of beings described as messengers or watchers. Whether these modern depictions are literal or metaphorical does not matter. What matters is the match. What matters is that Leonardo placed a gesture with universal presence in a moment of revelation and collapse, as if marking a point where human understanding intersects with something else. And so we return to the question that has been echoing through this investigation. If Leonardo encoded a warning, what was he warning us about? Was he suggesting that the story of humanity includes influences we have forgotten? Was he pointing to a universal symbol of transmission used across cultures to signify contact with higher knowledge? Or was he simply fascinated by the patterns of reality and chose to hide one of his discoveries inside a sacred composition? The answer remains elusive, but one truth becomes impossible to deny. Leonardo da Vinci created art that was not meant only to be seen. It was meant to be questioned. It was meant to be decoded. It was meant for a viewer who would come many generations after him. And now that we are finally noticing the patterns he left behind, The Last Supper stands not only as a masterpiece of religious art, but as a map. A map leading toward a truth Leonardo believed humanity would eventually be ready to confront. As we reach the end of this investigation, one thing becomes undeniable. Leonardo da Vinci created a work that was never meant to be understood at a single glance. The Last Supper is not only a reflection of a biblical drama, it is a vessel containing layers of intention that stretch far beyond the surface. The gesture hidden among the apostles is not a coincidence. It is a deliberate choice from a man who believed that symbols travel farther than words, and that truth often survives best when disguised. For centuries, observers stood before the mural and saw only a depiction of betrayal and devotion. Yet Leonardo knew that human perception evolves. He knew that future generations would have tools and references unimaginable in the 15th century. He trusted that eventually someone would recognize a gesture that does not belong to the emotional vocabulary of the scene. A gesture that appears across civilizations, myths, and modern representations of beings described as messengers or watchers. A gesture that raises the unsettling possibility that Leonardo was pointing to something he believed existed beyond ordinary human experience. Whether he encountered this symbol through ancient manuscripts, esoteric traditions, or personal observation is a question we may never answer. What matters is that he embedded it at the exact moment when the narrative fractures, when hidden truth collides with human emotion. Leonardo placed the gesture in a position where revelation becomes unbearable, and where the boundary between the divine and the unknown begins to blur. He refined it repeatedly, ensuring it survived time, restoration, and scrutiny. In doing so, he created a coded message that could only be fully recognized 5 centuries later. A message that forces us to question the limits of what Leonardo was willing to suggest. If he believed that patterns connect civilizations and that symbols reveal more than text, then the Last Supper becomes more than art. It becomes a record, a map, a silent testimony from a polymath who saw the world not as a static image, but as an unfolding structure of hidden connections. The gesture may not give us definitive answers. It may never be proven to carry the meaning some believe it holds. Yet its presence forces a shift in perspective. It invites us to consider that reality contains layers we rarely notice, and that art can preserve truths that exceed its own century. Just as Leonardo predicted, understanding emerges slowly, piece by piece, symbol by symbol. The Last Supper continues to guard its secrets, but today you have seen one of the most compelling clues it holds. And now the final question rests with you. If Leonardo chose to warn future generations through a gesture hidden in plain sight, what do you think he wanted us to see?